Just the data back with us, Dean Crook. Dean, how was your vacation, my friend? We missed you last week. Ken was awesome. We had a great conversation, and we're looking forward to today's conversation because we're going to discuss. We all know the horror that's happening in the Ukraine, and it's funny, with every adversity comes a seed of an equal or greater benefit, and you see the courage and the just sheer determination of the Ukraine people and the president and everything, which is super cool. But today we're going to analyze the data. What does this mean to the North American supply chain? What does it mean to your customers? What does it mean to costs? And what does it mean to looking forward?
Yeah.
To the HPLS podcast. Live, relevant, and high performance information, conversations, and education weekly.
That little intro with the DD for Triple D Day, Dean, Dan, and DJ. We got to add another D somewhere floating in.
Yeah, we got to get another one flying in somewhere. Yeah,
I got my dog here.
That's a good observation, DJ. That's a good observation.
Oh, I got another D there.
Yeah, it's I don't know if you guys read the report from Wall Street Journal this morning, and I'll get into it in a bit. So just to set a baseline for today for everybody that's watching us live. Yes. There's horrors going on. There's courage. There's unbelievable determination. It's not really what we want to get into in the comments. So if you can keep the comments to the data, we would really appreciate it. We're not war specialists. I honor the Ukraine people for what they're doing. It's obviously, again, a horror over there, but I don't think the three of us, and gentlemen, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think the three of us want to get into a war conversation. This is more about...
It's more data and
exactly. And it started last week, right, DJ, when you and I were talking about what is going to be the topic for this week. And then I heard like ArcelorMittal, Carlsberg, Nestle have huge plants in Ukraine. And full transparency, I had no idea there was, and ignorance, I'll call it ignorance on my part. Yep. I had no idea the Ukraine housed any kind of major corporations, but then you start looking at the exports of the wheat, the barley, and all the different stuff. And then you transition that data into now, the cutoff of Russian oil and what it's going to do to gas prices. And then the U.S. releasing 40 million new barrels for reserve and all of the, and then all of a sudden U.S. tankers are getting seized in France. And there's all these things happening. And it's kind of like you stop and you go, like, for lack of a better term, holy shit, we already have enough supply chain issues as it stands. And now we're going to have this. So we asked Dean to pull some data on exports out of the Ukraine, kind of what that data tells us. What are we looking at? Where can we source it somewhere else? And just to have a general conversation. So you, the sales rep, if your customers have business in these areas, you can send them this, you can have a conversation with them, and you can try and help them source some supplies or something somewhere else. That's kind of the strategy for today.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, yes, it's a fascinating discussion. Again, this just highlights our dependency on exports and imports, right? It's imports in particular, because people said, well, why do we import oil from Russia? Well, if you think about, we imported about 8% of our crude oil came from Russia in December. So it's not a lot. They're not a big supplier, but we still consume far more oil than we produce domestically. Right? So we have to import some, but it's a matter of geography. If you look at where our crude oil comes from in the Permian Basin and Cushing, Oklahoma, it all gets pipelined into the Gulf Coast. But refineries on the East Coast in New York, for example, and the West Coast, they're not connected by pipelines. So about half of the Russian oil we import goes to the West Coast, but it comes from the East Coast of Russia across the Pacific to the West Coast. And there's a thing called the Jones Act, right, that limits the size of ships that can move freight domestically. So it's uneconomical to take a shipload of crude from the Gulf Coast, where all the oil is pipelined in from Cushing and the Permian. You can't load a massive crude oil tanker and take it around to Los Angeles. Can't do that. So economically, it makes more sense for us to bring it in. It's also a higher sulfur content crude, which is it's more profitable for refineries. But it's filled the gap from our sanctions on companies like Iran and Venezuela. So when we so we've had to get excess oil in from somewhere, and a lot of it comes in from Russia. The excess comes in from Russia. So oil's one thing, but oil was already going up before this, right? So remember, we had a massive pandemic. The global economies opened up rapidly. Demand far exceeded supply. This is just a great lesson in supply and demand. We are needing far more crude oil than we are producing. Back in 2012, we had 2,000 drilling rigs here in the US producing oil. Today, we've got 600.
Hold on.
Right?
So you had 2,000 in 2012, and now you have
during
600?
During the peak of the fracking boom, we had just about 2,000. It peaked at 2,000 drilling rigs. That's why everywhere you went in the country, you saw pneumatic tankers hauling cement and sand and flatbeds hauling lumber and steel. Sorry, not lumber, steel and casing and drill pipe. So now we're down to 600, right? So we're not, so hopefully, well, I shouldn't say hopefully, but because there's always a bright side to high oil prices. It means more investment in drilling. It means more freight for truckers to haul. So even though you've got higher diesel prices on one end, generally it means you've got more freight to haul, assuming there's more investment in the drilling part of the industry. Remains to be seen if they do that, because they've been reluctant to invest in more drilling, more drilling activity. So that's sort of the oil side of it. So it's just exacerbated. West Texas Intermediate hit $110 overnight a barrel. Diesel's already at $4.10. So when I do the math on that, at current spot rates, you're running about 26% of fuel is about 26% of your revenue. Remember previous shows, 25% is the benchmark.
Yep.
2019, when we had the record bankruptcies, it was 32%. So if oil goes up and rates come down, now rates have been going down for about 6 weeks. They ended at $265 for dry van last week. That's line haul excluding fuel. If rates go down, significantly, and I don't think they will, but if they did and they got to $220 a mile, if rates dropped, let's say they dropped 40 cents a mile, and diesel stayed at $4.10 across the board, you would be at 32%. You'd be back to 2019 when we had Celadon and New England Motor Freight go bankrupt. So for those listening, what's really important here is not so much the price of crude, per barrel, or the cents per gallon of diesel, or the rate per mile, but it's the relationship between the cost of diesel and the revenue you earn. And so this is where I think it's really important. A lot of spot market carriers, remember, we have double the spot market volume in the last 2 years.
Yeah.
So DAT's volume of contract dropped 14%, spot jumped 14%. Volumes were flat across the board, but we had a massive shift from contract freight to spot. That's why a lot of carriers got into the business, because they could make so much money on the spot market and had all these apps on phones to find loads. The problem is that if they, and when you go to your broker, right, and he says, here's the rate for the load, it doesn't pass out the fuel surcharge necessarily. It's an all-in rate.
It's an all-in,
so if the carrier doesn't understand the rate per mile for line haul plus the fuel surcharge that the shipper's paying, eventually, and if they're paying $4 a 10 at the gallon at the pump every day, eventually the cash flow just diminishes, like your margins just diminish over time. And that's why high fuel prices are one of the big catalysts for bankruptcies, especially carriers in the spot market. So if you're thinking about your capacity, like to move freight that's already been tight, helping people understand the relationship between diesel as a percentage of revenue is really, really important. That's why they've got to get the full cost recovery of the fuel surcharge. And they don't necessarily do that all the time. So that's diesel. Ukraine's a bigger exporter of wheat than the US. That was last year. They surpassed us for the first time. The other one, though, this is an important one, especially for a lot of Canadian farmers. Russia's the largest exporter of fertilizer to the US.
Yes, I read that this morning.
I see
high
that
fertilizer
too.
prices is going to be reflected in the bills that we all pay for our food. They're a big natural gas supplier. Here's something I hadn't thought about. So Russia, Germany's a big relier on natural gas from Russia. That's part of the reason I think there's this fight over turf. But so if Europe decreases its dependency on natural gas, and the US is a natural gas powerhouse, what do you think that means for fracking activity to get more gas out of the ground and exported to Europe for US companies?
It has to.
Yeah, so that's the other side of this, is if Europe decreases its dependency on European gas, or Russian gas in particular, then we could see some impacts. And the last data point is Professor Jason Miller looked at a lot of data points, and he said that he looked at the top commodities that we imported from Russia, mostly metals. It was kind of interesting when you looked at the big volume ones: pig iron, nickel waste, rare earth metals, semi-finished products of iron, radioactive chemical elements, isotopes, titanium, and then oil. So if you think about supply chains that are dependent on metals, right, you can see more impact on supply chains there. So there's lots coming. This is kind of an evolving story, but wheat exceeded $10 a bushel for the first time since 2008 this morning. A bushel is a 60-pound bag. So I think what we're seeing is a rapidly increasing global inflation situation, and that's going to mean that we're all going to pay more for a lot of the things we're buying. So that's certainly not good news until things settle down.
So in the Wall Street Journal this morning, Volkswagen halted production with its main German plant and in other factories because of supply chain bottlenecks caused by Russia's invasion. $110 a barrel, they reported as well. The U.S. is releasing 60 million barrels. Wheat futures trading in Chicago reached our highest level since 2008, which means like bread, everything we use wheat for. iPhones and other products halted all sales in Russia. DHL suspended inbound shipments. I mean, and it goes on and on and on. Like Russia's invasion of Ukraine could lead to a prolonged global supply crunch of our agricultural fertilizers.
Exactly. Yeah. So I just want to sort of wrap up on the crude oil thing. It's currently, even though there's all the sanctions going on, there are no sanctions against Russian oil from any country. Right. The world is just not in a position to just reject 6 to 7 million barrels a day of oil exports, right? The problem is, though, that Russia's having a tough time selling their oil because companies want to avoid doing business with them.
So you would think that if you look at like the way the ruble has dropped in value,
right,
you could pick that stuff up for a steal, right? But I guess it's the perception of dealing with them. I guess it's the for lack of a better term, excuse my ignorance. Is that more what it's about, Dean? You think?
I think it's the perceived, it's the risk. It's the long-term risk of being seen, because I think it's a little bit like some of the movements we've seen in like the Me Too movement. Some of those other movements. This one seems to be, Germany's changed their position in terms of being involved militarily. That hasn't happened for decades. So. And some of Russia's closest allies are getting involved in sort of denouncing what's going on. So there's kind of this unprecedented movement that's pushing back on dealing with anything that. So just going back to my vacation, this is kind of a point. This is a worthwhile point. My wife and I were having dinner on the pier in Barcelona last Saturday morning, and we were sitting on this outdoor restaurant watching the harbour, and parked across the way is this massive super yacht. It was a $200 million super yacht.
Sweet.
Owned by, guess who? A Russian oligarch.
No, Russian oligarch. Okay.
It turns out there's like 7 of them parked in the harbour, and some of them are getting repaired. And they're looking at, confiscating them is the right word, or doing something like they're tracking them. So there's all sorts of stuff going on around the world where people are saying, we can't be associated with this, and we can't just give it lip service. We can't say, oh, that's bad, and then we still deal with them economically. And that's the sort of shift that I'm seeing right now. And maybe if I could share, I talked to a trucker in Russia overnight to get ready for the show. A friend of mine over there, and a friend through social media. We chat on via video call, and he's also makes Caterpillar engines. There's very few trucks, American trucks in Russia, and there are hardly any with big Caterpillars. and he's the guy that makes them. And I asked him if I could just read what he said to me. I said, "How's it going over there?"
for sure.
Yeah. He said, just a month ago, things were going very well. Everything seemed to be getting better. But here, this war with Ukraine, our people are generally against it. The economy flew down. The ruble is falling at an enormous speed. The dollar is growing. Prices in stores have skyrocketed for literally everything, for food, clothing, household goods, and so on. Large companies selling household appliances did not work for more than a day because prices jumped 40%. So,
Wow.
so if you think about the internal impact on just the Russian economy and all those folks that are working in factories that export stuff, that the wheat, the farmers, the crude oil, all that, this is unprecedented, and it's still evolving. So I'm not sure where this lands, but the one thing for all of us in the truckload business, from a supply and demand perspective, I think on the supply side, we are going to see a lot higher prices for everything we're buying, including transport. Shippers are going to see it, because the fuel, the higher crude oil prices and diesel prices get passed on to the shipper, who makes things that we buy.
Yep. And it's
And that's
already, I mean, I've
right,
been saying
right.
it for a while. The
Yep.
last couple of grocery shops that I did,
Yeah. Yep.
Like most families, it's typically the same stuff you buy
Right.
every week. And,
Right.
every couple of weeks, it might be different stuff, like different meals and stuff and that
Yep.
kind of stuff. But
Yep. Yep.
primarily it's the same stuff. And what
Yeah.
used to be $300 went to
Yeah.
$350. The
Right.
last week was $415. And I was like,
Right.
this
Right.
is insane. Like we're talking, well over $100 to $120 increase,
Right. Right.
minimum and I mean, it might not be, but for me, it's what feels like the last 3
Right.
weeks.
Right. Right.
But I'm
Right.
sure it was going up progressively. So what do we see? Like, what is the data telling us for container shipments? Because I know, as it is right now, they're saying it's a crunch. Russian vessels are being seized, and like France has seized 2 of them at their ports, and they said they're not being released. The seafarers are being detained, all this kind of
Right.
stuff. But what does it mean for things that are moving in that kind of Black Sea area, in that
Yeah.
side of the world, coming to North America? What do we see from a cost perspective? Because obviously, if that goes up, and
Right.
it's then you have the cost of trucking going, and everything
Right.
just kind of
Right.
snowballs, right?
I think, so if you think about, the Bosphorus Strait, where a lot of that oil comes out of the Black Sea area, that's international waters. So Turkey have shown some reluctance to closing that off to tankers. That's why people are saying, we're just not going to deal with you. You can't process your payments. We're not going to accept the vessels. Even pilots that board those vessels are saying, we're not going to board the vessel to bring it into port. So there's that level of disruption going on now for anything that's got a Russian tanker. There's also the seizing of vessels that are transporting goods for sanctioned companies. We've seen that off the French coast this week. I was at the Rock of Gibraltar last week. About 30% of global trade moves through that 14-kilometre strait between Gibraltar and Morocco. Places like that won't be affected necessarily, because a lot of that trade comes out of the Mediterranean. That's not necessarily that close to where it is. A lot of that trade comes up from Asia through the Suez Canal anyway. So I think that I don't know that. I think there'll be sort of a lot of disruption because of these vessels that are not allowed in. I think the bigger impact will be on air cargo. Jeff Dickinson just made a point there in the Slack, in the channel there. You would have seen that the world's largest air cargo freighter, the Antonov, got hit in Hostomel in the Ukraine. Antonov Airlines run the big heavy lift planes. There's only one of the AN225 in the world. It's about a 600-ton gross weight liftoff type plane. It's a massive plane. It got hit in a hangar. I watched a video by Dmitry Antonov last night on YouTube, and he said he's 99% sure it was destroyed. Now,
Oh, you mean it got hit in the hangar from like a missile or something?
By a missile, yeah, and 3 other Antonovs. Now, that leaves 5 Antonovs still flying, the heavy lifters. So if you think about the people that move heavy lift freight around the world, like the big heavy cargo and the big high volume cargo, that'll take an impact. You've also got the shutdown of airspace over Ukraine and Russia. So you've got, extra fuel burn, I guess. You've got more disruptions there. So on the container side, though, Dan, we import a really small, it's less than 1% of our containers come from Ukraine and Russia. really, really small. It's mostly the bulk. It's the bulk liquid stuff and the dry bulk, the wheat, the grains, the metals, the steels, things like that. Not so much on the container side. So
Got it. So that bulk is going to increase huge, which is then if you
yeah,
look at like
yeah,
Carlsberg, Nestle, and all these
right,
companies that export out of there that can no
right,
longer export it, they now have to source it
right.
somewhere else.
Right. So that's where you'll see the disruption in the supply chains and
Okay.
the impact on inflation, because it's very hard to move supply chains quickly, especially
Yeah.
given what we've been through in the last 2 years, right? If you think about the disruptions we've had, this is like that domino effect we talked about a few shows ago. Like it's like one thing after another keeps going wrong. It's like a fire was on a ro-ro vessel coming across from Germany with Volkswagens, Porsches, Bentleys.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It burnt and went
Volkswagen
to the bottom.
IDs and all that. One of the
Well, it
EVs
was
caught
an
fire.
Audis. It was coming to Rhode Island, just south
Mhm.
of where I live, because that's where they bring a lot of these cars in, and then the trucks come in and pick them up. Well, that went to the bottom of the ocean a couple of days ago, that vessel.
Yeah.
So like there was 4,000 cars, I think, on there. Like, so
Yeah.
if you're buying if you had a car on order, yeah, we tried to buy a new car late last year, and the guys at Audi said it'll be 6 months before. This was like in the middle of last year. It'll be 6 months before we can get anything remotely close to what you want. I said, oh, okay, so we went and bought another brand. But
I've had
is like
an F-150 on order since
right,
January last year. I was
right,
supposed to get a
right,
2021.
right.
You look at Ford, they had all the chips on that tanker that hit the
Yes, right,
liquid tanker.
right.
And then those fell. Then they finally got chips in, then they put 1,400 trucks on trains and the train
Yep,
derailed.
yep,
And then,
yeah,
and last night I heard on Biden's State of Union that
yep,
Intel is investing 80 billion or something in like the largest transistor plant manufacturing in North America,
right,
just south of Columbus. I think he said 80
yeah,
miles
yeah,
west of Columbus or something.
right,
Um,
right,
because I do think there's this big push in North America to be like, self-sufficient, because I think supply chains have shown us that we rely elsewhere too much,
right, right.
you know.
I'll just yeah. So go on.
No, I was just actually going to read some of the comments here because Jeff was saying
Yeah,
he read that
yeah,
container costs are 30,000
yeah,
plus
yep,
from Business Insider.
yep,
And for all of you, I mean, it's going to be a big link to actually, no, just Business Insider. If you just Google war, Ukraine could triple ocean rates in
yeah,
2022 to 2033. That'll give you a good idea. Yeah, but okay. So if these bulks, okay, so I mean, there's positive and negative with it, I guess. And I don't
right,
mean, I'm just
right,
looking from a logistics perspective. So from a
right,
logistics perspective, if we have to source wheat and barley from somewhere else, where would that
right.
typically be sourced from then, Dean?
Australia, mate.
Oh, there you go. Okay. Okay. Well, there you go. There you go.
Why not?
Okay.
Australia's one of the biggest exporters of wheat. So
So
Australia will
that
be a
means
lot.
more capacity is going to start coming out of Australia. Rates out of Australia are going to rise. It's going to be a
Yeah.
more of a rush to get containers or ships
Yep.
to Australia.
Yeah.
Correct.
So you got to position the dry bulk tankers, the dry bulk, the dry bulk ships. You've got to compete with, Australia's the largest exporter of coal. You've got the biggest coal export port in the world in Port Hedland. So a lot of your dry bulk ships will go in there to load coal. It'll cost more to reposition wheat and dry bulk ships if you can get them to there, and then it'll cost more to bring them back. So,
Which means more cost to us again.
Yeah. The other thing that's kind of interesting, they're expecting a big surge in import container volumes this year. And there's also a sense that inventories are building more rapidly. So a lot of this volume that came in that was sitting on vessels offshore before Christmas, it was at 109 on the 9th of January. It's down to about 50 today. So the number of vessels waiting is dropping dramatically. But a lot of that volume is still coming through our freight networks. And the problem, and they think, and of course, we're now into that March uptick in import volumes through the summer. So we're now back into that phase. But the problem is going to be that we've had such a massive volume of imports. How do we get all these empty containers back?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So I think what we're about to see is a massive buildup of empty containers in empty container yards around the country, because there's just simply no capacity to move this big. The surging volume from last year is kind of sitting around the country. When they get unloaded and empty, how do you move them back? That's going to be another thing that's going to start to impact the markets.
That's interesting. That's interesting. So, for all you reps out there that are listening and watching, hopefully watching live or listening in the replay, some gold here from what Dean was talking about. Number one, if your customer imports wheat or barley or anything, the next place is going to be Australia. So get on that, get some numbers for
Yep.
Australia, get capacity, start talking to your team that does overseas. If they start really looking at that air freight market to help them complete the supply chain in the
Right.
interim and how to
Right.
mitigate it. Now,
Right.
obviously,
Right.
the
Yep.
costing is going to be the costing, but at least if you're in
Right.
front of
Right.
it and can kind of,
Yep.
advise
Exactly.
them as to what's happening, get some freight
Yep.
costs, get some air
Yep.
costs.
Hey, Dan, the other thing that to watch is for everybody thinking about supply chains, not a lot of our truckload freight comes from imports. Somewhere it's less than 10%. But because it's so heavily concentrated in ports that are in big cities and big freight markets, it does have a disruptive tone to it. But the Omicron variant is rampaging through Hong Kong. China is having a hard time trying to keep a lid on this. So I think if you think about our mask mandates were lifted here in New England over the weekend, so we can go anywhere we like everything's back to normal. But it's far from that in other parts of the world. So I don't know that we're out of the woods yet on this. I think there's more supply chain disruptions coming for anybody that's thinking about, bringing, for your example, bed sheets from China to Orlando, right? Like you had 18 months ago. Those sorts of disruptions are still very much top of mind for me. If you're thinking about your customers and where they bring their goods from.
Well, yeah, because I also heard that Asia now, like China, if there's an outbreak, they're literally shutting
Yes,
everything down, and
Yeah.
you bet.
it's like a zero tolerance kind of
Oh
thing.
yeah, yeah,
In Ontario here, we just had, as of yesterday was the first, so we just had capacity restrictions lifted,
right.
and vaccine mandates lifted,
Yep,
like to get into restaurants and all that kind of stuff. But it's still masks and everything, so that hasn't been lifted yet. But I guess that'll be next, right?
Mhm.
right,
Um, but what I've found over the last little bit is there's been so many disruptions in China because of the zero tolerance. It's like we've had orders set up, and
Yeah.
then somebody in the factory or the factory next door got COVID, and they've shut the whole block down. And our
right.
factories have called us, told us like, sorry, and
Mm,
like we've had everything set up, and
mm,
it's kind of like
mm,
now it's gapping space on
right,
containers or on
right.
vessels kind of thing, and
Mm,
we've had that happen quite a few times actually in the last 2 months.
right, right.
Right. And it's
I've
like,
just
okay, well, when are you open? And it's so much uncertainty leading up to
right,
it. Then
right,
it leads
Yeah.
up to it. And like everybody in that space opens at once. And then everybody's like grabbing for containers, like, oh, I need to get it out of there now. I need to get it. And then all of a sudden the cost goes up again.
Yeah.
right, right. This is such a rapidly evolving story. I was just looking at the West Texas Intermediate and the Brent crude oil price this morning. Here, I just had a quick look at it. Brent's up to $113 a barrel. Um,
Holy
OPEC,
cow.
right? So the OPEC and its oil-producing allies, they're going to hold production steady, which is kind of bizarre when you think about how good oil is at the moment. But they're going to increase
Mhm.
production in April by about 400,000 barrels. But we're 30 days away from that.
Yeah.
So because right now supply is tight and demand is high, and that's why we've been seeing high diesel prices for some time. So I think those of us that those listening and thinking about talking to our asset providers and our shippers, there's a lot more pain to come here. I feel for carriers that don't have a good handle on their operating costs. If you said what was the one thing that everybody should be sort of thinking about now in the truckload space, and that is making sure that your carriers have a really good handle on their operating costs, because diesel's going to continue to climb in the short term. And ultimately, it means all of our prices go up. But I really feel for that small carrier who's not getting full cost recovery of the fuel surcharge. They will be out of business in a heartbeat if they're not careful. And that's just
And
going to
that's
make it
another
harder to move
reason
things.
why another reason to try your best to stay out of the spot market.
Right.
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 Like just eat
Yeah.
and my
Yeah.
suggestion would be, even if it's partnering with a 3PL
Right.
that you
Right.
like, like I've got a reverse engineered theory where you
Right.
partner with five
Yeah.
of your top carriers and you literally
Yeah.
become the sales force for them. You know,
Yeah.
as a 3PL, a lot of the times they have more reach than a smaller carrier, right? They can
Right.
afford to
Right.
pay salespeople and all that.
Right.
And that
Right.
relationship turns out to be
Mm.
a really good thing
Right.
when everybody's working towards the beneficial part of the relationship, when
Right.
everybody's
Right.
working towards the same end goal.
Yeah.
And
Definitely.
I've I dealt with it in 2019 where I had great carriers that I loved. And all of a sudden it's like, sorry, man, we're going out of business. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, man, we got, and it's like, cause your business might be solid and you might be giving them a decent profit, but they're playing in the spot market over here. And I think, personally, I think now is an even better time that you say that, Dean, because, you have if you have a truck, it'll be loaded mentality, right? Because it's a trucker's market. You have rolling steel, you're gonna get loaded.
Yep.
But now, as we're approaching, 25% now, is it going to be 27% next week? Is that 32% mark?
Exactly. Yeah.
It's a great time to have a conversation and say, like, listen, let's keep each other healthy. Let's bound together and get through this, because everyone's going to suffer. But let us try and be the catalyst to help you get through it, right? And as soon as capacity starts coming up, the first thing that's going to happen is shippers are going to want cheaper rates.
Right.
It's what happens every single time.
Right.
Every single climb is followed by a big dip. Like we've all been around long enough in this market and in this industry to know, no matter what, when freight rates rise, they eventually come down. Now, I was having a conversation with a student yesterday, and he said, do you think they're going to go down again? I said, I think they will go down, but I said, I don't think by very much, because as an asset-based carrier, you're already paying some companies are paying their drivers double what they used to pay them.
Exactly.
So there's all these hard costs in the background that have risen that cannot come down, because the last thing you're going to do is go to your drivers and say, hey, I was paying you, X amount. Now I'm going to cut that by 30% because you won't have a fleet. They'll all leave. It's, a little different from 18 to 19, like, 18 to 19, it was this massive increase in capacity, which, and, I believe also shippers getting smarter at shipping that dropped, like, annihilated prices. But I see them going down, but not by much. But if your costs are staying high and your rate goes down, that's your margin you're playing with. And then if you have that gap of fuel, and like, man, you're in a position for a world of hurt.
We are still, spot rates across the board for dry van, flatbed, and reefer are still 40 cents a mile higher than this time last year, to your point. And when you look at the shape of the graphs, Dan, you can see that it's rates have been dropping for about 6 weeks, but only ever so slightly, dropping more so in reefer. So I think if you said, what do we need to be watching? Reefer rates have dropped 13 cents a mile in the last couple of weeks. But that's seasonally normal before produce season starts in April, and then they'll take off again. The one to watch, though, is flatbed, right? So flatbed rates are climbing while the other two are dropping. And, of course, we're in the, steel production's up, housing demand is strong, but we're also in that spring inventory build phase where Home Depot, Lowe's, Canadian Tire are all stocking up their inventories for the peak in construction and building and gardening that comes in the spring. So flatbed capacity is going to be exceptionally tight this year. The shape of the charts look identical to last year and 2018, which was a flatbed bull market. That whole rate rally in 18 was driven by flatbeds and the industrial economy and the economic stimulus that came with all of that. So flatbed's going to be particularly tight this year, tighter than it was last year. Rates are already much higher than this time last year. If I can tell you what spot rates are on the flatbed side. Flatbed, they're 57 cents a mile higher than 2018 this time. Flatbed rates. Line haul, 57
and
cents
Ryan
a mile
says
higher.
as well, show freight is back, taking up quite a bit of flatbed availability.
Yeah. You always see that over winter, right? When flatbed demand falls off, I always see truckers with headache racks that haul flatbed sitting under a dry van outside a theatre over winter. Yeah, it's the capacity migration that I've been talking about for a while. So yes.
And just to be totally transparent with your customers, don't promise them that. Well, it is. And you know what? Here's the thing is you don't know, like even today, it's like, you speak to, and trust me, everyone that I speak to, my whole mission is like dedicate, build a relationship. And it's like, but they don't know when they're going to be where they're going to be. And if they're going to lose freight because of this and that. And it's like, the whole market is just crazy.
And new trucks aren't coming out of the factories anytime soon, like in the sort of numbers where we can add capacity. So that's why capacity will remain tight across the board, I think. But just to wrap up, I don't know that we're going to see spot market volumes drop too much, Dan. A lot of shippers have purposely pushed a lot more volume to the spot market, because when they'd put out their annual contract bid, they'd ask a carrier to bid on all lanes, when in fact about 30% of those lanes never had a load moved on them. Or one or two. So what they've been doing with these mini bids is sort of just looking at the majority of their business and letting these smaller volume onesie, twosie lanes go to the spot market. So that's why I think you're seeing more volume in the spot market, and that may help keep some carriers going. But man, these diesel prices are going to start to hurt some carriers really quickly. I mean, they're paying more for fuel, food, tires, everything anyway. To your point, I don't think we'll see the crash that we normally see in spot rates.
Well, I've found this year, more often than not, I'm in a big group chat with a bunch of sled heads, a bunch of snowmobilers, and every day there was like no fuel at this gas station, no fuel at that gas station, no fuel at that gas. Now we're talking only premium, but like we have seen more and more and more. And when my son and I were away for a week, 3 times we stopped at a gas station, there was no fuel.
No fuel.
It's like, okay, go to the next one, and it's like somebody just came in and bought 1,300 liters.
Do you drive your sled in? Is that what you do?
Oh yeah. Drive it right in, right off the trail, right into the gas station, pump it right there.
They got snow on the concrete.
No, but I mean, so you got a good 3 minutes, 4 minutes with no snow before your sled starts overheating. And it also depends on how long you've been riding, how cool it is when you get off the snow, how hard you hit the gas when you're going. You can kind of like putt down and it's pretty and especially up in northern Ontario and stuff, it's pretty intense where they literally, like, the groomer that grooms the trail will literally come right off into the parking lot of the gas station, then turn around. So you almost have like a groom trail right into the pump. Oh yeah. Like in northern Ontario, a lot of the snowmobile trails are actually logging roads. Right. So it's like you're going by massive logs, and it's like, 14 feet, 15 feet wide, 20 feet wide in areas. Like it's a full, there's 20. So in my area and in Ontario, I think there's like 160,000 kilometers of trails or something.
Wow.
Like, you can go like on a good winter, you can go from literally my door, if you like, I mean, if you really wanted to, all the way to BC.
Huh. Wow.
Yeah. I mean, you'd really want to have to do that, because I think it would be like a 3-week trip. But it's you can pretty much, I mean, interconnected from literally pull right out of my driveway. Hit the trail. Once you hit that trail, they're all connected in some which way, shape, or form.
Hey, I was just reading Ryan's comment about show freight, and it just got me thinking. My trip to Spain really gave me a sense that the global economy is just itching to get open, like back to traveling. So the traveling thing was, we went to Spain. We didn't have to have any PCR tests to go into